Hi guys, today I'm going to be doing a lens comparison video between these two popular prime lenses, the Canon 35mm f1.4 versus the Sigma 35mm f1.4, and I'm going to start right now. Hi guys, and welcome back to the channel. So in this video we're going to be doing a lens comparison between these two very popular prime lenses. Now these are both Canon EF fit lenses, so do bear that in mind that there are alternatives, especially when it comes to the Sigma. You can get it in a Nikon fit and you can also get it in a Sony E fit, but this particular one is the Canon E fit because we're going to be comparing it to the Canon 35mm f1.4 to work out what one is best and what one is deserving in a spot in your camera bag. So without further ado guys, let's get started. Right guys, so the first thing we're going to be looking at is the build quality of each of these two lenses and what one comes out best when we're looking at each part of the build quality. Now let's go and have a look at the Sigma one first. So the Sigma is made out of a complete metal or aluminium construction. Ever since Sigma released their Art Series lineup back in 2016, they've released, instead of creating this kind of cheap plasticky feel lenses, they've made more of these premium kind of aluminium and magnesium construction lenses, which really does add a sense of premium feel to them, especially if you compare it to any of the prime lenses out there. Now, if we go ahead and compare it to the Canon, it's a little bit of a different story. This lens is actually made out of premium plastic, which more fits with the lineup that Canon have. A lot of their L series lenses do follow this kind of premium plastic feel. Now, they have designed this to kind of reduce the weight down, because obviously metal is a lot heavier than premium plastic. But again, with the build quality, I must say I do prefer the Sigma over the Canon, although the Canon has got a big advantage when it comes to the build quality. This lens is weather sealed versus the Sigma, which is not. So let's say you're going to more of a wet or dusty environment. Let's say you wanted to bring these two lenses to the beach. I would say the build quality of the Canon lens would be far and above over the Sigma lens in that particular aspect. But again, you're not necessarily going to be using these lenses out in the great outdoors. 35 prime lenses are great for kind of landscapes, but I would say other zoom lenses have the same capabilities, because usually if you're shooting landscapes, having a wide aperture isn't necessarily important. But let's say you're more in a studio setup, 35mm prime lens might be perfect. And again, you're not necessarily going to need weather sealing in that aspect. So in that regard, I'm going to be giving the check mark to the Sigma lens, as I prefer the overall build quality over the plastic construction that the Canon lens is made out of. Although do bear in mind, if you are after a lens that offers weather sealing, the Sigma lens isn't necessarily going to be the one for you, and the Canon lens might be right. But again, I do prefer the metal construction over the cheaper plastic construction than the Canon is made out of. So the check mark is going to the Sigma lens in this round. So the next thing we're going to be looking at, guys, is the f-stop of both of these lenses. And would you believe these have got both the same f-stop, both f1.4, which is incredibly wide, especially if you compare it to a few of the other lenses with similar build quality and price range. The Sigma lens has an f-stop of 1.4, which is great for creating shallow depth of field, but also creating good low light capabilities. It means you can have quite a low ISO and quite a high shutter speed without having any underexposed photos. And it goes exactly the same for the Canon lens. So I'm going to be giving both of these lenses a check mark in this round, and they both have identical f-stops. So the next thing we're going to be looking at, guys, is the image sharpness, or what has the best resolution out of these two lenses. Now, I compared them side by side, and I must say it was very, very close. Both of these lenses, wide out, are incredibly sharp, although they do sometimes have a little bit soft corners, especially if you're shooting at f1.4. But to get absolute perfect sharpness, both of these lenses are optimized for f8. So if you are after the sharpest optics out of either of these two lenses, make sure you do shoot at lower apertures. Now, which lens is sharpest out of the two? That's the question. Well, out of the two, I must say I do prefer the optics of the Canon. I noticed an ever so slight sharpness over the Sigma lens, but it is very, very minor, maybe 5 to 10% sharper, which in the grand scheme of things, you're probably not going to notice. So in this round, I am going to be giving it to the Canon lens, but do bear in mind that the Sigma lens is not far behind. So the next thing we're going to be looking at, guys, is the lens flaring and how well these lenses suffer when you do point them at bright lights. Now, of course, both of these lenses are 35mm wide angle lenses. Having lens flaring is actually quite important. You're going to have quite a wide angle, so you're going to have to be careful with any bright lights. And it's good to see both of these lenses do come with lens hoods inside the box, because again, you're spending an awful lot of money on both of these lenses, so you want to have at least a little bit of protection when it comes to any bright lights. Now obviously, because these are wide angle, they've got a petal shaped lens hood, so obviously you need to be careful, especially with the edges, that you haven't got any bright lights like the sun pointing into them. But again, if you do remove it, I was actually pleasantly surprised with the quality of how these lenses suffered. Both of these lenses do have UD elements, which is designed to reduce the amount of lens flaring, but out of the two, I would say the Canon had ever so slightly less lens flaring, and the lens flaring was a lot more muted, where I noticed the lens flaring with the Sigma had a funny purple hue to it, which I'm guessing is something to do with the coating on the front element. So if you wanted a reduced amount of lens flaring, or if you know that you're going to be shooting in any bright light conditions, I would say the Canon is better in this round, although both of them are very similar. But because of the less muted tones that you could see in the Canon lens, I'm going to be giving the Canon lens a check mark in this round. So the next thing we're going to be looking at is chromatic aberration, or colour fringing, and how well these lenses suffer from it, especially at low apertures such as f1.4. And I must say, out of the two, I was pleasantly surprised with the quality of the chromatic aberration. It was incredibly low, and even if you shot at f1.4, the corners only suffered from an ever so slight amount of chromatic aberration. But what lens is best? Well, out of the two, I must say I did prefer the Canon, as it did have an ever so slight reduction even at f1.4 with chromatic aberration, because that's something that really can affect your footage, especially if you're cropping in a lot. It can be really pronounced, especially on higher megapixel cameras, such as the brand new Canon EF R5 or R6. So out of the two, I would probably recommend the Canon over the Sigma if chromatic aberration is going to be an issue for you. Of course, you can obviously get it rid of in post, but if the lens doesn't necessarily suffer from it, it's not something you're ever going to have to worry about. So the Canon wins in this round. So the next thing I'm going to be looking at is distortion and vignetting. Now, because both of these are wide angle prime lenses, they don't suffer much from distortion. Now, as you can see from both of the charts, this is the 35mm Canon versus the Sigma 35, and you'll notice the distortion is very minimal, and this is because these are both prime lenses. Really, zoom lenses do suffer from distortion, where prime lenses, because how the optics work, because they're not zooming, distortion isn't necessarily an issue. But because these are wide angle prime lenses, vignetting is a little bit more of an issue than you would expect. So if you go ahead and look back at the graph at f1.4, both of these lenses suffer from quite bad distortion, especially if you turn peripheral illumination off on your camera. Now, a way to mitigate this is to simply turn on peripheral illumination, or simply step both of these lenses down to around f2.8. This is where the distortion and especially the vignetting completely disappears. But what lens is best? Well, out of the two, these lenses are very, very close, but I did notice ever so slight vignetting, especially a reduction with the Canon lens. So if you are after a lens that performs better optically, especially when it comes to distortion and vignetting, the Canon lens will probably be best for you. So that's the lens I'm going to be giving a check mark in this round. So the next thing I'm going to be looking at is the overall image quality and what lens performs optically better, especially if you place it on a higher resolution camera. So if we have a look at the Sigma, it did suffer from a little bit of distortion and a little bit of vignetting, especially over the Canon lens, which had a slightly better, especially when it comes to vignetting. But overall, these lenses are very, very similar. But what lens is best? Well, apples to apples, I would actually say the Canon creeps out an ever so slight lead, especially when you're looking at sharpness in the corners and when you're looking at chromatic aberration. So if you are after the optically best performing lens, then I would say the Canon lens is the one for you. But again, this is a lot more expensive. So if you're after a more budget orientated lens, which really does have great optical performance, but again isn't necessarily as great as the Canon variant, then the Sigma lens is going to be perfect for you. But again, this is just looking at the overall image sharpness and the overall image quality, and I would say the Canon is ever so slightly better. So that is what's going to win this check mark in this round. So the next thing I'm going to be looking at is the size of each of these two lenses, and this could be important if you've got quite a small camera bag, or if you just simply want to bring one lens with you when you're going out doing street photography, as 35mm is a great focal distance for if you're doing street photography or even if you're doing some wide angle portraits. So what lens is smaller? Well, as you can see, if we do compare it side by side, you can see the Sigma lens is a little bit smaller. It also has a slightly smaller girth, which means it will fit into more camera bags easier than the Canon lens. And if we compare it in size, you can see it's also slightly shorter as well. So if you are after a smaller lens, the Sigma lens will be better for you. So that's what this lens is going to win a check mark in this round. So the next thing we're going to be looking at is the filter thread of both of these lenses, and what lens has a larger filter thread. And this is easy to work out because both of these lenses have the filter thread written on the lens. This lens, the Sigma 35mm f1.4, has a 67mm filter thread. 67 is actually quite a common filter thread size, and the filter threads are actually going to be quite cheap, especially if you're after a circular polarizer, an ND filter, or even just a UV filter to protect the front element. So you're going to be looking at around £20 to £30 for a UV filter. And the Canon lens comes in at just 72mm, which is slightly larger, but again, quite cheap when you do compare it to any of the larger prime lenses, such as maybe the 85mm, which has a 77mm filter thread, a lot more expensive. So if we compare the two, they're both fairly cheap, but if you are after a lens which has got the smallest filter thread size, then the Sigma wins out. So that's the one that's going to be getting a check mark in this round. So the next thing we're going to be looking at is the weight of each of these two lenses, and this could be a big problem, especially if you're looking at wanting to use just one lens all day. You're going to want a nice light lens. So what lens is best if you're wanting to just use one lens all day? Well, the Canon lens comes in at 760 grams, which out of all of the lenses is actually quite heavy, and it almost weighs the same as a lot of the DSLR and mirrorless cameras out there, especially the Canon R, which comes in at almost the same weight. But how well does the Sigma stand? Well, you'd think it's made out of a metal construction, you'd think it'd be heavier, wouldn't you? Well, actually, the Sigma lens is lighter, coming in at just 665 grams, almost 100 grams less than the Canon lens. So if you are after the lighter, smaller, and especially less weightier lens, then the Sigma lens wins out. And I must say, I've been using this lens for almost a year now, and it's one of my favourite street photography lenses, and it's sometimes I only bring this lens out because of how light this lens is, and it also fits in my camera bag really easily. So if you're after a more portable lens, then the Sigma lens is perfect for you. So that's where this lens wins again in this round. So the next thing we're going to be looking at is the focus ring of each of these two lenses, and how well it's easy to manually focus this lens either for photography or for video. Well, both of these lenses have great focus rings. They're both incredibly large, especially for a lens of this size. As you can see, it takes us almost 30% of the actual size of the lens, and it's exactly the same for the Sigma. And how well are these with smoothness? Well, I've tried both of these lenses, and both lenses are incredibly smooth, and they both include a focus window. So if that's something that's important for you, both of these lenses are included. Now, if using these lenses for video, let's say you want to do focus pulls, both of these lenses really do perform really well in that aspect. And for video, these lenses are absolutely great, especially if you're always using it on manual focus. It is incredibly smooth to use. So because of that, I'm going to be giving a check mark to both of these lenses in this round, as if you're wanting to use this lens for manual focus, the focus rings on these lenses are exceptional, especially compare it to any of, let's say, the Tamron lenses, which I find have got slightly smaller focus rings, or even if you're comparing it to the Samyang ones. The lenses have great focus rings in that regard. So the next thing we're going to be looking at predominantly affects videographers out there, and this is focus breathing. Now, which lens is best when it comes to focus breathing? Well, just as a recap, focus breathing is when you're focusing at an object quite close to you, and you go ahead and zoom to infinity. You might notice that the lens zooms out or zooms in ever so slightly, and this is what you call focus breathing. Now, because both of these lenses are prime lenses, they don't suffer from much focus breathing, but especially if you compare it to any of the cine lenses out there, these lenses are a lot worse. But again, that's because cine lenses are designed for video goers. So because these are more photography lenses, obviously they suffer from a little bit. But what lens is best? Well, out of the two, I did notice the Canon lens was a little bit better with focus breathing, but there isn't a very large difference. This also could affect you if you're wanting to do any focus stacking. This is where you take a photo at different focus points, let's say you're doing product photography, and then you combine it all into one image. If the lens has a little bit of focus breathing, this could affect your final result. So having a lens that doesn't really suffer from focus breathing is really important, and this is why I always recommend using either macro lenses or try and use prime lenses for any focus stacking photos, because zoom lenses especially sometimes have a big problem with focus breathing. But out of the two, if you are after a lens that optically performs better for video, then I would recommend the Canon lens over the Sigma lens, as it does have less focus breathing. So that's what this lens is going to win in this round. So the next thing I'm going to be looking at is how fast each of these two lenses are when it comes to focusing, as this will be incredibly important if you want to take photos of any fast moving objects, or if you're just after a nice fast focusing lens, as everyone is. So what lens is best? Well, if you have a look at the Sigma lens, all of the new Sigma Art series and all of this, especially the Sport series lineup, has incredibly quick focus motor. And also, if we look at the Canon, again, all of them have built in an ultrasonic motor, which is Canon's flagship focus motor technology. And this is incredibly fast, especially when completely wide out. You're going to have a very narrow, shallow depth of field. So you want them to be fast, but you also want them to be precise. And out of the two, I must say I did find that the Canon lens was better performing in that regard, especially in low light. And even if you screw a 10-stop ND filter, both of these lenses can focus through that filter, which is great to see, especially if you wanted to do any long exposure shots in the daytime. But again, out of the two, I would still say the Canon lens is a lot more precise, and it is also an ever so slight bit quicker. So if you're after a great lens that can focus really quickly for sport, then I would recommend the Canon lens. So that's what's going to get the check mark in this round. So the next thing I'm going to be talking about again is all about video. How loud are these lenses when they're on? Well, because both of these lenses don't have image stabilization, that's something you haven't got to worry about. Sometimes if you have the image stabilization on some of the lenses when you haven't got it on a tripod, it can make this whirring clicking sound. But again, because both of these lenses don't have image stabilization, that's not going to be an issue. So how loud are the kind of focus motors of each of these two lenses? Well, out of the two, I would still say the Canon lens has a quieter ultrasonic motor. Ultrasonic, again, stands for ultrasonic, means really quick, but also really quiet. And again, it is really precise. But again, if you do want to mitigate any clicking or whirring sounds, all you'll need to do is just simply turn off the image stabilization and simply turn off the ultrasonic motor. Both of these lenses do have an ever so slight clicking sound. So the way to mitigate this is, like I said, simply turn off, so just have it on manual focus, but also either use an external microphone like the microphone I'm using now, or simply just use a lapel microphone, which is one of the microphones that can fit on your lapel. Another word is a lavalier microphone, and that will completely remove any of the clicking sounds that you get from either of these two lenses. But if you don't have a microphone and you're wanting to use the automatic focus, which you know is a lot easier, especially if you're brand new to video, then I would probably recommend the Canon lens for video, because it is ever so slightly quieter and you probably won't have to remove any of the clicking sounds in post. where if we go and have a look at the Sigma, it is ever so slightly louder and it's a little bit more noticeable, which can be sometimes off-putting if you're in a studio like myself, where sounds can bounce off and you don't want it to make any noise, especially if you're using the internal microphone. So out of the two, I'm going to recommend the Canon lens for this. So that's what's going to get in the check mark in this round. So last but most importantly is the price. And there is a massive difference between these two lenses. So if we go and have a look at the Sigma actually comes in at a rebate price at the moment of £619. And you're looking at obviously the EF mount and the Nikon mount and the E mount all come in at roughly the same price. So if you're getting it on sale, you're looking at around £600, which is great value, especially for a 35mm f1.4 prime lens. So let's have a look at the Canon. Now, usually Canon is a little bit more expensive than the third-party makes. So how much are you expecting this lens to be? I was expecting it to be around about £1,000, because, a lot of the lenses out there are going to be around about that price. The problem is, the Canon lens is not £1,000. It's actually closer to £2,000. It's £1,749, and the price has gone up ever so slightly ever since Canon released their new RF lenses. So I'm not too sure why the price has gone up, but this lens is incredibly expensive, especially when you compare it to the Sigma lens, which optically is very, very close. So you're not going to notice much of a difference. And I must say, I had to do this comparison, and I really had to pixel peek between these two lenses, because I really didn't notice much of a difference. And the grading that I've done today are so close. To be honest, I would recommend both of these lenses. But if the price is really important to you and you want to save yourself money, this lens is 3 times cheaper than the Canon lens. And I must say, you can buy 3 of these lenses and throw 2 of them away and still save yourself money over the Canon lens. So out of the two, there is absolutely no competition. The Sigma lens wins hands down in this round. So that's what's going to be getting 2 check marks. This is just so expensive, I just seriously can't recommend this lens over the Sigma lens, even though it is technically optically better performing. Brilliant, and there we go guys. So that is my lens comparison review between these two popular prime lenses, the Canon 35mm f1.4 versus the Sigma 35mm f1.4. But what lens do I recommend? Well, I graded these lenses both on 15 different criterias. So out of the two, the Sigma one came in head over heels better than the Canon. The Canon only won 7 out of the 15 different criterias, which to be honest isn't great. Although it did have better optical performance, such as chromatic aberration, it did have a reduction in lens flaring, I still would say the Sigma lens, comparing it, is not far behind. And because this lens is lighter, smaller, and with a smaller filter thread, this lens is perfect if you're out traveling and you want a nice small compact prime lens. This lens also has a lot better price point. You can buy 3 of these lenses and still be better off versus the Canon lens. So out of the two, I just can't recommend the Canon lens over the Sigma lens because the price point is just so large. And even if you try and find a second-hand one, you're still going to be probably paying around double the price that you would do with the Sigma lens. And because if you buy the Sigma lens at the moment, you've got a cashback deal, which I think runs out in the end of September, you can save yourself £75, which makes it even better saving or better value for money if you do purchase the Sigma lens. And because of the filter thread is also a little bit smaller, you're not going to be spending so much money on circular polarizers or any ND or UV filters. So out of the two, I've just got to recommend the Sigma lens over the Canon lens because it is just so much better value for money. Again guys, if you want to like, comment and subscribe to my channel, it really does help my channel grow. Also, if you want to hit the bell notification so you don't miss any of my reviews or Lightroom tutorials. But until next time guys, keep creating.